For most of the 20th century, Russia had been locked inside a rigid communist system where ambition was something to be hidden, not displayed, and wealth was something the state controlled, not the individual. But when the Soviet Union collapsed and Boris Yeltsin rose to power in 1991, that entire structure shattered almost overnight. In an attempt to drag Russia into the modern world, Yeltsin unleashed a wave of radical economic reforms that were supposed to turn a centrally planned economy into a capitalist one in record time. Prices were deregulated, borders were open to imports, and state-owned industries were suddenly thrown into the open market. On paper, it was a transformation meant to bring prosperity. In reality, it detonated the country's economy. Inflation ran wild. Savings evaporated. Factories shut down. Industrial output collapsed by roughly half. Unemployment surged, and millions of ordinary Russians who had lived modest but stable lives found themselves plunged into poverty almost overnight. Pensioners sold their clothes on the street just to eat. Wages went unpaid for months. Entire regions slid into desperation. But while the majority of the population suffered, this chaos created something else entirely: opportunity. In the vacuum left by a collapsing state, a small number of ruthless, fast-moving individuals discovered that the rules no longer mattered, and that timing, connections, and nerve were more valuable than experience or morality. One of those people was Boris Berezovsky. Berezovsky did not come from privilege. He was born Jewish in a deeply anti-Semitic society, with no ties to the Communist Party elite that controlled advancement in Soviet life. Under the old system, his ceiling was low. He was intelligent, mathematically gifted, and academically inclined, but without political connections, his future would likely have been quiet, constrained, and unremarkable. That limitation vanished the moment communism did. In the new Russia, intelligence combined with aggression could rewrite destiny, and Berezovsky had both in excess. He began modestly, exploiting a simple flaw in a collapsing financial system. Hyperinflation was devouring the ruble at astonishing speed, turning money into a melting asset. Berezovsky realized that if he could delay payments long enough, inflation itself would erase his debts. He started buying cars on consignment with minimal down payments, agreeing to pay the balance later. Months would pass before manufacturers were paid, and by then, the rubles they received were worth a fraction of what they had been when the deal was struck. On paper, the transactions were legitimate. In reality, inflation was doing the theft for him. It was legal, elegant, and devastatingly effective. That loophole was his first real fortune, but it was only the beginning. By 1994, Berezovsky was no longer a man scraping for leverage. He was wealthy, ambitious, and increasingly visible. And visibility in post-Soviet Russia was dangerous. One afternoon, sitting in the back of his Mercedes, glancing at an expensive watch that to him represented lost opportunities rather than time, Berezovsky's ascent nearly ended in an instant. A bomb detonated beneath the car, engulfing it in fire and shrapnel. Glass exploded, metal twisted. When he clawed his way out through smoke and flame, disoriented and bleeding, he turned to find his driver decapitated by the blast. This was not an anomaly. In 1990s Russia, contract killings were routine. Business disputes were settled with bullets, poison, or explosives. The country earned the nickname the Wild East for a reason. But surviving that assassination attempt changed Berezovsky. It clarified something brutal and unavoidable. Money alone was not protection. Wealth made you a target. What he needed was power of a different kind, influence that reached beyond balance sheets, protection that came not from bodyguards, but from proximity to the state. He needed politics. Not as a politician, but as something far more dangerous. A man behind the curtain. At the same time, public anger toward Yeltsin was boiling over. The economic transition had devastated ordinary Russians, and by the time the next presidential election approached, Yeltsin's chances of re-election looked grim. This terrified the men who had grown rich from the chaos. A return to communism would mean confiscation, prison, or worse. So Berezovsky and a small circle of ultra-wealthy businessmen struck a deal that would reshape Russia permanently. They became known as the Seven Bankers. Together, they poured enormous sums of money into Yeltsin's re-election campaign, not just through official channels, but through media manipulation and backroom influence. In exchange, they were granted access to the crown jewels of the Russian state. Under the guise of privatization, Russia's most valuable assets were sold off at absurdly low prices to insiders with the right connections. Oil, gas, mining, banking, and media empires were handed over for fractions of their true worth. What should have been competitive auctions were effectively rigged transfers of national wealth. Berezovsky was rewarded with control of ORT, Russia's largest television channel. From there, he transformed it into a propaganda machine, flooding the airwaves with favorable coverage of Yeltsin while burying criticism. The election, which Yeltsin had seemed destined to lose, was narrowly won. And with that victory, the oligarchs didn't just influence the government, they owned it. Between them, the seven bankers controlled nearly half of Russia's wealth. They dictated policy, crushed rivals, and operated without oversight while the rest of the country sank deeper into poverty. And still, Berezovsky wanted more. It was during this period, aboard a yacht, that he met a younger man with an audacious proposal, Roman Abramovich. An orphan raised in brutal conditions, Abramovich had clawed his way out of obscurity through relentless entrepreneurship. From selling rubber ducks to trading oil, he had an instinct for opportunity and scale. His pitch to Berezovsky was simple and terrifying in its ambition. Acquire Sibneft, merge it with existing operations, and create a vertically integrated oil giant that controlled extraction, refining, transport, and sales. Abramovich needed something money alone could not buy. Political permission. Berezovsky provided it. Through influence inside Yeltsin's inner circle, Sibneft was privatized and sold to Abramovich for around $100 million, despite being worth several billion. The real currency of the deal came later, delivered quietly in suitcases of cash. Millions at a time. Untraceable, unspoken, necessary. For a while, the arrangement worked. Abramovich built an empire. Berezovsky collected tribute. The oligarchs thrived, and then history intervened again. By 1999, fear returned. The communists were resurgent, and Yeltsin's health was failing. The oligarchs needed a successor, someone controllable, someone quiet, someone they believed they could manage. They chose Vladimir Putin. At first, Vladimir Putin looked like the perfect solution. He was quiet, disciplined, and came from the security services, not the political spotlight. To the oligarchs, that made him predictable, useful, a man who would keep the seat warm while they continued running the country from behind the scenes. Boris Berezovsky, in particular, believed he had earned this outcome. He had helped to engineer the system, financed the campaigns, controlled the media, and smoothed the path that led Putin straight into the Kremlin. In his mind, Putin was not a threat. He was a beneficiary. That illusion did not survive contact with reality. Almost immediately after taking power, Putin began signaling something that sent a chill through Russia's elite. He spoke openly about restoring order, about the humiliation of the Russian state, about the dangerous fusion of money and political power. And then, in a move that was both symbolic and surgical, he went on television and announced that the oligarchs, those who had combined capital and influence, would cease to exist as a class. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was a warning. Behind closed doors, the message was even clearer. The oligarchs were summoned and given a choice that only looked like a choice. They could keep their wealth if they stayed out of politics, paid their dues, and never challenged the authority of the state. Or they could resist and lose everything. their companies, their freedom, possibly their lives. Most of them understood immediately. Roman Abramovich understood. Abramovich had never been sentimental about power. He had grown up with nothing, lost everything early in life, and learned to survive by adapting. When the rules changed, he changed with them. He stepped back from politics, aligned himself with the new order, and ensured that his wealth flowed in ways that did not threaten the Kremlin. He paid his tribute quietly. In return, he was allowed to keep his empire. He would later even be rewarded with political appointments and international legitimacy, including ownership of Chelsea Football Club, a symbol not just of wealth, but of survival. Boris Berezovsky could not do the same. For Berezovsky, this was not just about money. It was about identity. He had not clawed his way out of obscurity, survived assassination attempts, and bent an entire country's media landscape to his will just to be told to sit down and shut up by a former KGB officer he believed he had installed. In his view, Putin was betraying an unspoken contract. Worse, he was rewriting history, casting the oligarchs as villains instead of architects. So Berezovsky chose defiance. He began using ORT, his television channel, as a weapon, running stories critical of Putin and amplifying dissent. He spoke out publicly, attacking the new president with a boldness that shocked even his peers. It was a miscalculation rooted in arrogance. Berezovsky was fighting the last war, not realizing the battlefield had changed. Putin did not need to argue with him. He only needed to apply pressure. Investigations were launched. Assets were frozen. Charges of fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering followed. The system that Berezovsky had once manipulated with ease now moved against him with relentless precision. By 2002, the threat was unmistakable. Arrest warrants were issued. Berezovsky fled Russia and resurfaced in London, styling himself as a political exile rather than a fugitive. But exile is not freedom. It is isolation. From London, Berezovsky continued to wage war, funding opposition movements, backing lawsuits, and throwing money at any project that promised to weaken Putin's grip on power. But his influence was gone. Inside Russia, the state moved quickly to dismantle what remained of his empire. ORT was taken back under government control. His business interests were stripped away piece by piece. Courts ruled against him. Assets vanished. And then came the final betrayal. Roman Abramovich no longer needed him. For years, Abramovich had funneled money to Berezovsky in exchange for political cover. Suitcases of cash had changed hands because influence demanded discretion. But once Berezovsky fell out of favor with the Kremlin, that protection became a liability. Abramovich made one final payment, severed ties, and walked away. No drama, no loyalty, just survival. Berezovsky's income collapsed. His lifestyle did not. He continued to live as if nothing had changed, maintaining mansions, private security teams, and an entourage that drained what remained of his fortune. Legal battles piled up. Divorce settlements carved deep wounds into his finances. Once a billionaire, he began to feel poor. Not poor by ordinary standards, but poor by the only measure that mattered to him: relevance. What hurt most was not the loss of money, but the loss of status. He had been the man people feared. The man deals were made through. Now doors closed. Calls went unanswered. Even Abramovich, once his protege, had surpassed him in wealth, prestige, and global standing. Berezovsky watched from the sidelines as the world moved on without him. That resentment metastasized into obsession. If he could not regain power through politics, he would try through the courts. He would force Abramovich back into his orbit. He would rewrite the story publicly, reclaim his importance, and if possible, reclaim billions along the way. So Berezovsky launched what would become the largest civil lawsuit in recorded history, suing Roman Abramovich in the English courts. The case was framed as betrayal. Berezovsky claimed that Sibneft had always been a joint venture, a 50-50 partnership, and that Abramovich had used threats and intimidation, backed by the Russian state, to force him to sell his stake for a fraction of its true value after he fell out with Putin. He demanded compensation not in millions but in billions. Abramovich's defense was devastatingly simple. Nothing had ever been written down. There was no partnership, no ownership, no proof. Only suitcases of cash and implied understandings that existed outside the law. For 9 months, the trial exposed the underbelly of post-Soviet Russia to the world. Judges heard how elections were manipulated, assets stolen, rivals intimidated, and fortunes built on corruption and fear. Both men admitted to acts that, in any normal system, would have been criminal. But the court was not there to judge morality. It was there to judge evidence, and evidence favored Abramovich. When the verdict came, it was brutal. The judge described Berezovsky as an unimpressive and inherently unreliable witness, willing to say anything to support his case. It was not just a legal defeat, it was a public annihilation. Berezovsky lost the case, lost what remained of his reputation, and was ordered to pay Abramovich's legal fees, tens of millions of dollars he did not have. In that moment, it became undeniable. The game was over. The man who once helped shape a nation had been reduced to a cautionary tale, a warning, a relic of a chaotic era that no longer existed. Berezovsky retreated into isolation, his mental health deteriorating, his finances collapsing, his sense of purpose evaporating. Soon after, he was found dead in his London home. Officially, it was ruled a suicide. Unofficially, questions lingered. In a life defined by enemies, violence, and betrayal, certainty was impossible. Whether he was killed or simply broken no longer mattered. What mattered was the ending. Boris Berezovsky rose from nothing, mastered chaos, bent a country to his will, and believed that power, once seized, could never be taken away. He was wrong.